Tetteh of Ghana is the UN Secretary-General's special envoy to the Horn of Africa. She cares deeply about climate, peace and security, especially how they're connected and most especially about how they're protected in the Horn of Africa region. I'm delighted to say that she joins us now. It's very good to see you. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. What I'd like to know is a little bit more about your role, what it is that you do and how your passion informs that.
Thank you for having me. The role of the UN Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa is a role that focuses more on the political peace and security challenges of the region. The region covers the area that involves member states of IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. And so basically we're talking about 8 countries: Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, and Djibouti. And within this very diverse region, which we refer to as the Greater Horn of Africa, you have some of the countries that are on the forefront of the climate crisis. And when I say forefront of the climate crisis, you can see the impact on countries, on communities, and on their development trajectory. And even though climate change is not necessarily a trigger of conflict, it can create the situation that causes tensions between communities that ultimately, if those tensions are not well managed, then they can drive existing conflicts or start new ones.
So it can actually complicate things, basically.
Yes.
I mean, I do want to look at the impact of climate change on these communities, but before we go there, I want you to explain to me the link between climate and security, because as somebody who works in the media, it is a connection which is either ignored or under-explained.
Well, if we bear in mind that the climate crisis, being that this is a man-made crisis, essentially is a trigger of security challenges globally, then that's our starting point. And that's not necessarily within the Horn of Africa, but within the Horn, especially with the countries that I've just mentioned, you've seen this manifesting in different ways. So for instance, in the area between Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, referred to as the Mandera Triangle, we've seen 5 years of consecutive drought. 5 years of consecutive drought in communities that are pastoral. And so essentially what that means is that their animals no longer have food and water. The areas in which they used to graze are no longer fit for that purpose. The pressure is going to create climate migrants. When they move into other communities and have to change their lifestyle from the economic activity that they have been used to for a very long time, and now try to adapt to other things, that in and of itself creates its own difficulties. And so if you just take that intersection between these 3 countries and you see what has happened over the last 5 years, and by the way, it doesn't look as if the next rain from the prognosis that we have so far is going to be any different. Can you imagine what that happens going forward when you don't find ways of bringing into play adaptation, resilience building, and alternative livelihoods? When people have no choices, what do? They begin to fight over the little that they have left.
You actually answered the question I was going to put to you about the impact on communities, so thank you so much for explaining that. But what happens if we don't take meaningful action now? We can talk about it, but the words have to have substance if we're to avoid the disaster scenarios.
Well, that's the reason why the UN Secretary General says that we should understand that we are in a crisis situation and we are failing at addressing that crisis, and which is the reason why we need to bring more seriousness to this issue. Because what you're seeing in the Horn is on the front line of people who have been impacted. Now, I know that last year, because of the floods in Pakistan, that is what is in the public's memory about what the climate crisis can cause to countries, and indeed has caused to Pakistan. But it's manifesting in different ways in other parts of the world. And on the African continent, in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel belt, this is where you're seeing the same kind of crisis, the same kind of tragedy unfolding in a different way from what happened in Pakistan. So the creation of the new fund to deal with issues of loss and damage is timely, is necessary, because the loss and damage is happening today. Now, I've talked about the areas in my region which are facing drought, but on the flip side, in South Sudan, You can see now that the way in which the crisis has manifested there is extensive flooding. That hasn't had the same kind of airtime as the situation in Pakistan. But there are states within South Sudan, which is a country that in itself is transitioning and trying to move out of conflict, where last year's rainwaters have not receded. And so communities that used to be agricultural, again, some that used to be pastoral, are not able to access the resources they have lived on. That's the urgency of now. And that's why this has to be dealt with now.
That's the point as well, that basically the environment or environmental concerns are feeding into geopolitical tensions from which nobody benefits effectively. That's what it's all about.
Absolutely.
But in terms of initiatives that are happening within the Horn of Africa itself, are there things which are really getting you excited and which make you feel that perhaps this negative tide can be reversed?
I must say that many of the countries in the region, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, are dealing with this problem themselves. I mean, they've started to deal with it from a perspective of government policy and investing resources. But the resources available are not enough to meet the scale of the challenge. The member states of IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development themselves, last year at a side event that we co-organized, we meaning the United Nations, my office, co-organized with IGAD on dealing with the climate crisis, agreed to establish a coordinating mechanism in order for them to be able to exchange across the region, because this is not an issue that respects national borders, so that there can be a regional response. And so one of the things that we want to look at this year is to crowd in finance for that initiative, so that the member states that have been proactive can deal with it. In Ethiopia, for instance, over the last 4 years, we've had the Green Legacy Initiative of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, where they focused on reforestation in a major way. And you can see that it is beginning to impact weather systems in a positive way. So it tells you that once you apply resources to try to work towards real solutions, you actually can effect change. And I think that's the most promising thing about this whole situation. We can make a difference if we pay attention now.
And let me stay with the idea of actually making a difference, because you are a highly experienced negotiator at regional, national and international level. So how do you think you can bring those skills to bear at Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week and going forward to help build that consensus and drive for the COP28? We talk about cooperation. How can we achieve that given these monumental events which are happening right now and also further down the line? What can you do to make that difference?
Well, one of the things that we have done, and we started with COP27, was to make sure that we were able to work with the countries to bring them together to have a consensus on this initiative. For the rest of this year and beyond, I am going to continue on making sure that that agreed initiative begins to get the attention of international donors and funding partners, so that we can make sure that some of the key projects that we have developed under that initiative already can attract the financing to be able to implement them. Because we can talk about doing things, of course you need to have an appropriate coordinating framework. The hard part of getting member states to accept that and to see the benefit of that has happened already. So now it's about making sure that the things that we talked about, the things that we identified, now it's to deliver on actually making them happen.
I have a feeling that you will, but Hanna, we have to leave it there. That was Hanna Tetteh of Ghana. She is the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa. Small island developing states is what the UN calls those low sea level island countries that are already feeling the effects of warmer and higher water. At COP26 in Glasgow, Tuvalu captured the world's attention on the dangers faced by islands all over the world. We are sinking, but we are all sinking, Tuvalu's foreign minister announced, standing knee-deep in water. He called for urgent international cooperation to meet the climate targets set in Paris. Well, James E. Harris lives on Vanuatu, a South Pacific nation made up of roughly 80 islands. He's also Vanuatu's Honorary Consul to the UK. He attended the IRENA Assembly here in Abu Dhabi this weekend as part of Vanuatu's climate delegation. He sat down with my colleague Christina Millman and told her that while Vanuatu is also already feeling the impacts of climate change, its government sees itself as part of the solution instead of a victim.
So it's actually being run through the United Nations General Assembly. we're seeking a referral to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. And the importance of this is that it will give us a set of guidelines for future reference, just to acknowledge and establish that climate change does exist, that certain commitments have been made that may not be being fully addressed as we speak, and to also acknowledge that there are countries that are disproportionately affected by climate change compared to their contribution to climate.
Now, you speak about being disproportionately affected, yet you are very keen to avoid any kind of labeling associated with being a victim.
Correct. I'm very keen, that's why I choose my words carefully. We're all victims of climate change, and so Vanuatu cannot sit there and put its hands up and just be a victim. I think we have to be part of the solution. We have to be part of a narrative that's positive and shows the way forward. And I believe how we can do that is because we're an ecologically pristine, carbon negative, non-aligned, peaceful archipelago of 83 islands. And I think we have the potential to be the poster child for climate finance. We have costed in detail, sector by sector, what requirements we have for addressing climate change in terms of mitigation.
I'm very interested in that, because this is the first case that I've heard of where there's actually a number associated with the cost of mitigating the impact of climate change. How did you work that out, and what's the number for Vanuatu?
This is a good question. We last year issued a document which is our nationally determined contribution. It's revised and enhanced. This sets out sector by sector exactly what we need to address. So whether it's in forestry, it even extends to cultural aspects, tourism, all the areas that are impacted by climate change. And we've costed and detailed what needs to be done, how. The sum total is $1.2 billion US. We've put that figure out there. We've committed to be carbon zero in energy by 2030. So the figures are there, our commitments are there, our goals are there, but we do need help to get there. And that is why I am here. I'm supporting our climate change minister at IRENA, and this is my first exposure to the Atlantic Council, which is a fabulous opportunity for me to extend from the government sector a little bit more into the philanthropic and private sector. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be here and to evangelize why Vanuatu should be ring-fenced and protected and become, as I say, a poster child for climate change.
Great, and we're very grateful that you made time to speak with us. Thank you very much.
That's all we have time for today on ADSW Live. Join us again tomorrow, and thanks for watching.